Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure to have with us tonight Dr. George Israel, who is an expert on China, which is a rather big subject. Well, welcome, Dr. Israel.
Thank you.
And hopefully we can get some of your observations about the extraordinary civilization and country that is China. And I will start off by asking you how you got interested in such a subject.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yes, in the 1990s, I spent a couple years in China teaching English, and thereafter I decided to pursue a PhD in Chinese history. And that's what I did at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and thereafter I've returned to China on several occasions for various reasons.
And so you've seen the country go through enormous changes and actually becoming a tremendous global superpower, rivaling the U.S. And as you observe the conflict between these two great nations, well, from the Chinese point of view, how would they like to see it turn out, if I can phrase it that way? Do they want to be accommodative? Do they want to just move their armies around the world and occupy Mexico? Or should we be worried about China as a potential enemy?
I think that under Deng Xiaoping in the 80s and the 90s, and then his successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, that the accommodative approach was definitely something that China took, thinking that that would be best for their, just in terms of their rise in the world. But since the presidency of Xi Jinping starting in 2012, China's definitely become, I would say, a little bit more aggressive in its approach to foreign affairs in the world, and that's brought it up more overtly into conflict with the United States. So I think that's where things stand right now, and that's the changes we've seen over the last decade, and that's those brought about by President Xi Jinping.
Now, is there some bitterness in China? They've obviously been through terrific upheavals, but the Opium Wars, the British coming in, the Europeans taking all those treaty ports, just kind of dominating their ancient civilization, and then the Japanese terrible events of that period. I mean, do they have some sense of bitterness or, I guess, absence of trust in the rest of the world? Do they feel that way, or you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct that for most people in China today, they do have this sense that China suffered unfairly internationally, going back to the Qing Dynasty up through World War I, World War II, well, especially the First and Second Sino-Japanese Wars. And thereafter, China's kind of had this dream, and this is something that Xi Jinping has talked about, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. That is, China should play a certain role, should have a certain status on the world stage, but that it still, in some sense, is sort of being contained by the United States and its allies. So I think there's a sense of resentment in that regard, whether or not it's reality or whether or not it's something that the government of China, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, promotes as part of its national agenda and to sort of deflect attention from problems that are going on internally. Those are things that could be discussed. But I think you're right that overall there has long been this sense that the reason that China is in the predicament it is has to do with these longer historical trajectories you're talking about, where China was sort of like taken advantage of by European powers and, of course, Japan.
Well, that's quite a story, and there's been a lot of centrifugal forces in Chinese history. The different states broke away, and they've had lots of conflict, and finally having a unitary government, if one can say that. Is that something that's the Chinese appreciate, or from a cultural point of view, or do they like that? The emperor's gone. Is it better to have Chinese party sort of put someone in Beijing, and then everyone can relax? The son of heaven is there, so to speak, and directing the world affairs. Is that a reasonable way, or do they, in the Western world, we have all these conflicts and one party is against another, and a lot of free discussion about different ideas, political ideas, and is that lacking in China as it tries this unitary governance approach?
Well, it's true that perhaps one of the achievements of the People's Republic of China from its declaration in 1949 of course, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, was that it was able to bring, sort of redress these unequal treaties of the past and bring unity to China as a nation. And it's always sort of been the case that the Chinese Communist Party has made the claim that sure, we don't necessarily have the freedoms that people have in a democracy, but this is what is necessary to maintain stability for the Chinese people. And so, and the advantage and the benefit that comes with that has been this sort of extraordinary economic growth that we've made we can claim to have brought to China and the Chinese people, lifting so many people out of poverty, especially after Mao Zedong's death in '76, and then with Deng Xiaoping coming to power thereafter around 1978. This economic miracle that we've seen over the decades. So I think that in general, the government of China does make this kind of claim that for China to remain stable and for China to see its optimal economic growth and its optimal position globally, geopolitically, it's best if it has this one-party state that leads it. So yes, I think you've made a good point there. On the other hand, you're also correct that some of the people, you might call them ideologues or people who sort of put the agenda intellectually before Xi Jinping, they do look at the West, they see a great deal of disorder, and they say this model is not going to work for us. These democracies are in decline. They're becoming overly indebted, their societies are becoming fragmented, they can't control various aspects of social change within their countries. So you're also correct to observe that. That's the argument that's also made. So since news information is tightly controlled in China, what people often see is disorder outside of China. That's how what's going on in countries like the United States, other democracies who China considers its competitors, are presented to the public in China.
Well, I mean, not everything has been rejected in the West, so their capitalist system is beneath the surface there. Isn't that correct? And many people are getting quite wealthy, many billionaires around. And I think there's some complexities with their tax system, but in any event, the government has encouraged a certain degree of entrepreneurship, has it not? And some people accumulating a huge amount of wealth, which the state might allow them to keep for a period of time. Any thoughts about that? How does that
Yeah,
compare?
that's absolutely true, that the model that we see during the Maoist years, which runs from about 1949 to 1976, was essentially thrown out by Deng Xiaoping, and he allowed a significant privatization of the economy, and that, in many cases that became some of the most productive parts of China. So this use of the term communist, even though we use that to call the party that governs China, is perhaps not so useful. Some have called the model there authoritarian capitalism. Okay, so I think you're absolutely correct to point that out. And in fact, much of the sort of economic growth that China has made has been driven by the sort of capitalist approach that Deng Xiaoping took going back to the 1980s, allowing people, for example, to open their own businesses, to profit from those, loosening up rules in the countryside so that people could lease land for extended period of times, buy and sell, that kind of thing. So you're also correct there.
Well, as China lurches forward, as we lurch forward, they have some problems, do they not? And the one might be the way the government handled the coronavirus. I mean, to make that comment, but particularly locking everything down excessively and whatever. And I'll also ask this question, which is the one that often is discussed in the West, is in Wuhan, where allegedly the coronavirus emanated. The Chinese government seems to have just closed the door on a discussion about that, and also the way they responded. At first, there was a great deal of braggadocio about their policies were something far superior to the West. They could just lock everyone up. And in the end, I'm not sure how well that worked. Is there criticism of the government in regards to this, or any comments about that?
Absolutely. So China's sort of zero COVID approach did not work. especially when later variants of the virus were circulating in China. They were apparently more contagious, more difficult to contain. And in fact, the Chinese government had some significant success at first, but when these outbreaks started happening in various cities, then they tried to lock them down. Eventually, by late 2022, come down to November, there were protests breaking out in the streets as basically people couldn't take it anymore. And so suddenly, the government decided to let off on that policy altogether, and within a couple months, the virus had circulated around China, and everybody just, as far as those protests went, some of those students that were out on the street protesting ended up in prison for a period of time. But then that whole topic was dropped. We don't know exactly how many people died as a result of that sudden circulation of the viruses, the different variants in late 2022 going into 2023. Some put it at maybe a million or two. But at that point in time, many among the elderly hadn't been vaccinated. So the government just decided that its zero lockdown policy, its zero COVID policy, was resulted in too much unrest. They saw a threat to stability, so they just let it go completely.
Well, now you mentioned it's a complicated society. There's a centralized government. They allow Western, I guess, capitalism to be there. And they control the media, or do they? So do people on the street really trust the government? The government is telling them this, telling them that. Do they say, oh, well, here, I saw this on television, or there are Chinese people that travel around the world and come back. Is there, beneath the surface, some mistrust of the government, or can you opine on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct that the government invests a significant amount of money into the control of information, and the information that people receive is definitely limited in ways that would probably not be able to understand so well. In the West, people in China perhaps a little bit more well informed than we might think, insofar as they can use like VPNs to get over the Great Chinese Wall. Social media, that kind of thing. Information moves around quickly in a kind of very coded fashion because certain words just can't circulate on social media. But in general, I think that the control over information is tight enough that that the average Chinese person has a difficult time imagining other perspectives on a lot of issues where we would be well aware of them.
Yes.
So it's a fair question to ask in that regard. Yes.
Now, what about social tension there? Apparently, there are a huge surplus of males. Yeah, that's always a problem. They had the one-child plan, and the general idea would be to have a male child as opposed to a female one. And there's I guess a gender misappropriation of, you want to use that phrase. There are more
Right.
males than females.
Mm-hmm.
And is that causing something beneath the surface? Any problems? Yeah, too many males around. They're pretty aggressive and might unhinge things. Is that noticeable?
I've heard this, but I'm not sure the extent to which it's a problem. You're absolutely right that with the one-child policy that was put in place in about 1979, 1980 or so, that was done at that time because there was actually an excess number of dependents in the household, and it made it difficult for Chinese to sort of free up their consumption. So the government put limits on that. And there were also other factors at that time where there was concern about this population explosion globally and the consequences of this, the inability to feed the population. But the net result of that is that now we've got the opposite problem, where we have an aging population, this sort of imbalance that you talk about. What it's meant, though, and I guess where it creates some intention unrest, is that for a man to find a spouse, he needs to be able to do something like show that he has a home or something
Yes.
like that. And that's becoming increasingly a problem because the cost of housing is arisen just to the point where a lot of people just simply can't afford it. So I don't think it's created any kind of overt unrest, but it is kind of a stewing problem, this imbalance that you talked about.
Now, one of the other things I think in China, or at least traditionally, they have the mandarins who were past tests back in the days of the emperor. Getting in a university is is it not a very competitive road to travel? The big tests that take place, and if you don't do well in the test, maybe your life is closed. Many doors are closed. Is that an issue in China with these university exams appear?
Yes, the pressure that young people feel in China and Chinese society is significantly greater than perhaps maybe the average person in the United States, a young person might experience in the West. At every level of schooling, from elementary to middle to high school, you're constantly tested, and you have to pass through major tests, especially at the end of high school. The Gaokao, the college entrance examination, is very intense and very difficult and competitive. But there's even a greater problem in that regard, is that even those graduating from universities now, about 1 in 5 aren't finding jobs. So you have this jobless problem among the college graduates. And there is some concern that could become a source of unrest in China over time here. So there is a lot of brewing tension under the surface in Chinese society, just as you've been pointing out here.
China and Japan, is that an underestimated tension point after the Japanese attack on China, the terrible atrocities the Japanese committed? Is that something that's almost like the Nazis and the Jewish people? Is that the level of, I guess, anger, suppressed anger, or?
I do think that remains a problem in China, insofar as also the Chinese government sort of promotes a nationalist agenda, especially in the wake of the presidency of Xi Jinping. And part of promoting that sort of nationalist agenda is that Chinese people constantly find themselves watching movies that sort of rehearse and bring back to the attention the atrocities committed by the Japanese during World War II, which are in fact quite serious. And the Chinese government will also make the case that Japan has never properly apologized and sort of rectified its own curriculum, that kind of thing, in terms of admitting to what it did during World War II. Of course, Japan's always been a competitor to China too, economically, in more recent decades, so that's an issue too. But I think for Japan too, just as for the United States and other countries, the concern is China's rising military spending, and that it's sort of become more aggressive about its own borders as well as in the South China Sea. And that's why Japan too has been sort of revisiting its approach to defense spending and its role that it's going to play in that part of the world in terms of sort of responding to the growing Chinese sort of threat or aggression as it's perceived in Japan.
Well, if you look at it from one point of view, if the U.S. is a rival, does China feel ring-fenced in a way by what they would call U.S. imperial policy? So they've hooked up with their, I guess, villainous enemies. They think that probably in some ways about the Japanese. And they've created, they've hooked up with India, and Vietnam is there, just going around the periphery of China, and they're trying to lock them in. Do you have thoughts about that?
You're absolutely correct, and this is something I mentioned before, that indeed both the government of China and the people of China do feel contained by the United States and its allies. Of course, that sort of umbrella of security that the United States threw over that part of the world, post-World War II, at first China benefited a great deal from that stability. On the other hand, now it does feel contained because, of course, the United States has bases in South Korea and the Philippines, because of our ties with Taiwan and Japan. So basically, for the government of China, they look off their east coast and the Western Pacific there, and they really do kind of want the United States out of that part of the world. And that is really a long-term goal. And that's why we often hear talk of perhaps, China by 2025, 2027, certainly by the centennial, its anniversary in 2049, China hopes to have this Taiwan issue resolved, because if it can project its power further out into the Western Pacific, that will substantially enhance its position, geopolitically speaking, globally. So.
Well, some of their maneuvers seem a little ham-fisted. The balloons coming over around over the U.S. It seems a little nutty to me. I mean, if you're a real superpower to do something like that, is the government fully in control of their, aggressive parts of the administration? the Army, their intelligence agency, are they totally in control of that? I mean, putting that balloon up there, did that come from the highest level in the government?
Well, I will say that one thing that Xi Jinping did when he came into power is he wanted, because of his own experience in the military going back to, say, the late 70s or so, he had a lot of ties. He's the chief of the military commission. That's one of his, principal titles. And what he's done since he came to power is to remove really basically all opposition to his own policies within the military. So I think he does exercise pretty tight control over these kinds of things. And I don't know about the balloon issue because I haven't looked at it very closely, what the outcome of that in the end was. But I think that few of these kinds of things happen by accident in the way in the way you're sort of wondering about there, that these things his control has become increasingly centralized, and it's pretty much, these kinds of things do pretty much come from the top down, and I think they're rarely accidental. Perhaps other actors within the government taking their own initiatives, that kind of thing.
So could we consider this as sort of a slap in our face? I mean, they imagine it will be discovered and they'll just get a sense of they're not standing still in a relationship, and it's kind of a chess match in a way, and
it is
sort of an overt something.
Yeah.
This is an overt hostile action that we're taking, and we're doing a number of overt hostile actions out there.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of test to challenge the United States to say, hey, to see how we'll respond to these kinds of events. What we're willing to tolerate and not tolerate as China sort of pushes the boundaries of the fold. And so that's true. I think China's just kind of testing the waters with some of these actions, but also saying, hey, we're now a major power on the global stage. And it's true that ultimately I think that Xi Jinping believes that China should be able to stand on a par with the United States, and that's ultimately his goal, and many of the plans that he's put in place reflect that.
A par or
above? Or perhaps just
above.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, maybe so.
In other words, it would be.
Yes, right.
If you're really a rocket ship going,
the idea was that the Chinese economy would eventually overtake the United States, but I think that's all been thrown into doubt now. And yes, I think the principal sort of symbol of this tension, of course, has become Taiwan. And the fact that the United States exercised so much influence over that issue has just always grated on the nerves of people in the Chinese military, Xi Jinping himself, and so on. That's why he always pays very close attention to that issue. Why we keep seeing sorties being flown in the Taiwanese Defense Identification Zone, these kinds of things, drones being flown, on the periphery or over Taiwan, that kind of thing, the missile launches, and so on.
Is China waiting to spring, so to speak? Is it? It's obviously they have tremendous information about the Western world. Our doors are open. Certainly, our patent laws are no protection, whatever. So, I mean, they're really exploiting a lot of the what they'd consider defects in our society. Are they going to spring? If we hear a lot of conversation right now. The U.S. seems distracted by its internal issues. It also is the resources the country has might be not what they once were. There's enormous national debt. There's a lot of concern about dropping standard of living. The political arrangements are very divisive. And the U.S. seems to be being enmeshed in two wars right now, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Russian-Ukrainian one, and so much of the U.S.'s wealth and budget goes to income transference, and all the complexities of our country. What do you think? I mean, in other words, do you think they'll send
I see a lot of speculation about this. Of course, we see how China's sort of responded to the conflict in Ukraine, its general support for Russia, but also a little leeriness in that regard because they don't want to completely offend the NATO countries. There's also speculation about to what extent China might somehow be involved in or behind or possibly have some role in what's happening now in the Middle East. The Chinese government always certainly has been supporters of Palestinian two-state solution, the PLO, and so on. Of course, we see China also as a backer of Iran. So there is speculation that, of course, China and Russia both want to see a multipolar world emerge where they have more influence. Is China somehow benefiting from the war in Ukraine, somehow benefiting now from conflict breaking out in the Middle East? That's an interesting question. I don't know. Are they waiting to sort of take advantage of the situation, sort of drain resources, watch the United States resources drain, become more taxed by these conflicts, and then take advantage of that to make a move on Taiwan? I see this kind of speculation go on. I'm just personally not sure. I personally don't think that China has some like imminent invasion of Taiwan planned, but I wouldn't bet on it. But definitely, I think that China plays things very carefully. They're worried about instability that might come to the Chinese society itself if they make any rash moves. So I don't think see anything happening in Taiwan in the near future. But it's definitely something to watch, how China responds to these conflicts to sort of reshape the world to its own benefit. And that's definitely the kind of geopolitical sort of positioning that's going on.
Now, you've lived in China for a number of years, and you've observed the Chinese people face up. And can you make any observations? Just the man on the street, the people you've met? I mean, they presumably are just pretty normal, pretty much like anyone else, or is their culture shaped by Confucius sort of values? They have a sort of a different view of the aged, old people, or whatever. I mean, do you have any comments from your time in China?
I personally have had nothing but a very above board and pleasing, satisfying, good relationships with the people I know in China and interacted with, whether friends that I made while teaching there in the 1990s or academics I've made friends with as a result of going to conferences over there, academic exchanges, that kind of thing. Sure, if you sit down with the average Chinese person, they're just as skeptical and critical of their government as anybody in any other part of the world. A certain part of the population is certainly supportive of Xi Jinping's nationalist agenda, others less so. And in fact, one problem that we see emerging is what Ian Johnson has called a kind of involution over there, a kind of inward turn brought about by Xi Jinping's government's sort of obsession concern with national security. So like, for example, in my case, I've had less opportunities to go over there, people a little bit more concerned about going over there, what will happen, that kind of thing. So this has just been a more recent development leading up to COVID, post-COVID times, that we perhaps see somewhat of an isolationist or inward turn within China, brought about simply by the fact that the government makes people more concerned about the consequences of interactions with people outside China.
We're getting near the end of our chat,
Okay.
but I'll ask this. What about the urban-rural kind of view of China? Are there 900 million pig farmers there that the government has to somehow incorporate in their nation state? I mean, people from the country are still haven't participated enough in the prosperity of the place. Is that an issue? Or accents, for instance, to people, oh, you're from the country and your accent is whatever. So this is not so much homogeneous, although it is more homogeneous in the West.
Right.
Nevertheless, these societal tensions are there, the new wealthy class. Any comments about that?
Yeah, there is a great deal of disparity between the rich and poor, the East Coast and the interior, the rural and the urban, just the kinds of things you're talking about. And these are the kinds of tensions that run across China. So perhaps I think that one thing that has happened is that the failure of the government to be able to sort of rebalance in the economy in a way that redresses these issues. Now, recently, however, the very fact that labor's become more expensive on the East Coast has led to a sort of relocation of manufacturing into the interior of China, and that's helping redress some of these imbalances. And I think it's being said that we expect a lot of manufacturing and these chains to move to other countries, Mexico, Vietnam, and so on. But it's easier for a lot of these multinational corporations now to just sort of relocate their operations to the interior of China, where they can still take advantage of those more lax, environmental regulations and the less expensive labor.
Well, Dr. Israel, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us tonight, and we'll have to have you back again. And ni hao ma.
Ni hao.
I don't know what that means.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.